Hello, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to the Evangelical Dark Web. Tonight, we have sort of a providentially timed live stream, and we should be live on YouTube, Twitter, Rumble, and also Twitch, if anyone's ever on Twitch. So, welcome tonight. It's a bit of a providential live stream, as again, I was coming up with this topic last night that we were finally going to get into this, and it is time to discuss the Owen Strand video, which falls perfectly and providentially in line with the Trump guilty verdict that was announced earlier today. So that's providential timing because I did not think they would come back with a verdict so soon. You obviously followed this case a lot closer than I did. Is that correct?
Uh, that's pretty much putting a very minimum floor on the extent you were following the case. I mean,
Yes.
I followed a lot of probably more reactionary content to the case. Obviously, I mean, yeah, they came back with a verdict that quickly. So wow, you knew it was you know guilty because it's a New York jury, and they convicted on all counts, I believe. So it was all up,
All 34 of them.
all 34, and they've essentially convicted him for paying his lawyer because that's what a lot of those counts were.
Yeah, he paid his lawyer, who then stole money or misappropriated. Because that I believe was like the bombshell testimony, was that Michael Cohen testified that he stole money from Trump. So that's totally legit.
And obviously Trump couldn't argue on his behalf that he was doing what his lawyer advised him to do, because that was, I guess, deemed not allowed by the
That was an
judge,
inadmissible defense.
apparently. Which, again, inadmissible defense should not be a word in the law. I mean, you should be allowed to use any sort of defense that you want.
Yeah, it's kind of wild. Like, we say innocent until proven guilty, but that, to me, the more you study like criminal law, I think the more that turns out to be a myth. Like, that's an ideal, but reasonable doubt should mean reasonable doubt, and you should be able to introduce a lot of arguments. I remember it was like the one case that was loosely related to Grace Community Church, and that guy was denied the ability to bring in testimony for fabulation, and the idea that these children were coached into saying that there was an SA going on
And just to give context,
by a therapist.
yes, these when certain accusations come up in therapy at a time when the idea of repressed memories are very, I guess, in
Very
vogue.
shady.
Well, it's also in vogue from like Hollywood. Like the show Dexter was all about repressed memories. But so I mean, when you have a lot of sensationalization around these things, and then they do impact the court and they do impact the wider culture, because what Hollywood portrays you get more of in society.
So I hope by now everyone has realized that the name of the live stream is completely sarcastic. Owen Strand saves the Constitution from Christian nationalism. Yeah, that is a very, ironic, intentionally so title for the live stream, because a lot of it was going to be focused on the Owen Strand, you know, trying to defend the Constitution from Christian nationalism in the video that he did. It's going to be the bulk of the stream. But with the onset of Trump's conviction, that just kind of makes it so much, it's aging like milk right now.
Well, it goes back to prove that you cannot expect a fair jury to rule in a high profile case, especially when there is racial tension involved. You see, I mean, you can go back to O.J. Simpson, where black juries, and those jurors were practically tortured, because I think they were essentially sequestered for much of the case, or if not all the case. And that case went on like 265 days or something ridiculous over a double homicide. So essentially, those jurors were prisoners themselves in deliberating on O.J. Simpson's not guilt. So that's one example. You obviously have Derek Chauvin, who was
That was a
essentially
short deliberation.
a 4-hour deliberation on on all counts of murder, which, even though they didn't even meet the evidence for premeditated homicide.
Well, they convicted him of premeditated
Yeah,
homicide,
they.
and then they convicted him of manslaughter. It's like, which one is it?
I think
You
they did
cannot be
second.
guilty of both.
I think they did three, like three
No,
different
yeah, it
murders.
was three. They got in between too. I think it was second, third, and manslaughter.
Then
They
you have
convicted Derek Chauvin of.
the taser lady who tased the black guy, convicted by a jury, despite the fact that no one goes to jail for that.
For tasing.
Well, for mistaking a handgun for a taser, no one has ever been convicted on that. That's not something people go to jail for because that's an
Yeah, but
honest mistake on the job.
I didn't think it was. I thought it was incompetence, and if someone loses
But
their
it's
life over it, that's
but
kind
it's
of a
still
thing.
a criminal offense. That's a civil offense.
Yeah,
And then, of
I'm a
course,
little. Again, I'm not very. I'm not a back the blue kind of guy. So to me, if a cop screws up like that, I believe in harsher
oh,
sentences for that.
is it a screw up?
Or is it just incompetence because of diversity hires? Which one is it?
Well, I think it was like a woman that should was like a desk worker that was put onto the streets because
Was
of
it a Meg? What was
labor.
that cop's name that was all in it was like Megan Hall last year. The Tennessee cop that got around.
I mean,
and,
and again, you could see this flare up
and she
again.
like was on her way out because she crashed like two patrol cars.
Who's surprised? But yeah, there's the case in New York on the subway choker. I mean, is that guy going to get a fair trial in New York?
I I would hope that the average New Yorker has had an awkward subway experience that would enable them to feel and then acquit. I think that guy will have a lot of witnesses show up at his trial in his defense. I don't think that's the same thing with Trump. Trump's lawyers, I don't know what the situation was with that, but didn't he like change his lawyers or whatever? So this guy, I don't think Trump had very good lawyers for his court dealings. And I believe Alina Habba was on the outs, right?
I mean,
Last I checked.
I don't think she was like the lead attorney, or maybe at least she didn't seem to function as the lead attorney during a lot of the case. That's my
Nor did
understanding.
she.
Well, the lead attorney I think was a guy, so that probably helps. But I mean, I don't know if good lawyers or better lawyers would have helped unless he hired like Dershowitz or
The
you know
Dersh.
someone that's like a silver tongue that has very
No,
good
these
experience in New
guys will
York.
tell you that the case would have been won or lost at jury selection. So to me, I think it matters. Like, what did Trump's lawyers do or not do during jury selection? You had a couple lawyers on there. Apparently, that didn't really matter. You had one person who said that they get their news from Truth Social and Twitter. Apparently, that guy didn't. That guy didn't show up for you. So I don't know. If I had to guess, and then you had a bunch of Wall Street Journal and New York Times readers. So it's like, yeah, this is not a good jury pool. You had maybe two jurors that would have been friendly to you just on that survey question, maybe 2 out of 12. And I guess moral cowardice on their part, but at the end of the day, it was a that was those were better odds than I thought Trump had going in. 2 out of 12, that is. So I guess and I feel like there's a couple more things to add with the Trump conviction. One, does this change the moral calculus? I think it does. I don't think it hurts the case for voting for Trump at all. Uh, and I think in the Owen Strand video, which we're going to be live reacting to, um, he's probably going to bring up the idea of a dictator or a Caesar or something like that. And what's happening to Trump is what would have happened to Julius Caesar had he not crossed the Rubicon. They were basically going to arrest Julius Caesar and convict him or kill him for competent governance was basically what they were going to throw at him. But in Trump's case, they were going to arrest him if he stepped down, but he didn't cross the Rubicon, and this is kind of what happens. I don't know. So maybe that'll be relevant to Owen Strand's commentary. I
I
don't
mean, it all
know.
kind of is relevant because now we're basically arguing that the jury system in America doesn't. You cannot expect a impartial jury, and as a basic constitutional right.
Uh, right. So I don't know. I thought Trump made a huge mistake by uh, having a jury trial in the first place. I thought, in some areas doing a jury trial was a mistake. Obviously, these judges were so corrupt, you might as well take your chance on a
Now I
uh,
know with New York,
regular,
it
jury trial rather than a bench trial.
well, I
But
know. Well, I mean, not with that judge, but in New York, apparently, I mean, it seems like their appellate courts actually do take the law seriously because they did overturn the Harvey Weinstein case, and
yeah.
that was because of process. And so there is a chance that the appeals court will be favorable towards Trump because there is a veneer of legitimacy that goes with them. Now, how much better he would fare than Harvey, who knows?
So this is Owen Strachan. Owen Strachan is a medieval personality. He is I don't know what to say about him specifically. This guy's had a lot of controversy over the years for a lot of different things. But last year, he decided that, anti-Christian nationalism was going to be his stake in the ground. Like, this was going to be his issue. And he's kind of had some very clownish attempts to argue it. I believe we've talked about this on the channel and definitely on evangelicaldarkweb.org, which you all should check out, by the way. And again, he's part of some big organizations like G3, which is a huge organization, but the personalities within those organizations are not that big, to be honest. But Owen Strachan, nonetheless, is trying to build a name for himself and use Christian nationalism as an issue to do so. This video apparently got a lot of street cred from some people out there that really hate not evangelical dark web, who really don't like Christian nationalism. So that's what we're going to be watching tonight. And don't forget to smash that like button. That really helps with the magical YouTube algorithms. And subscribe to the channel, to the podcast, if you are new. So I have yet to watch this. So here we go.
My name is Owen Strachan, and I will be your host. Please subscribe to this podcast on all relevant platforms. We are told today four realities today that I'm going to cover in this episode. We're told today that the Constitution is a dead letter, or in slightly different language, it's no longer operative. People aren't living by it, and so we don't need to continue to act as if the Constitution matters at all. For example, here is a recent tweet from a man named Nate Fisher, who has been a vocal proponent of what is called Christian nationalism. I understand nostalgia for the Constitution, or longing to restore the principles the founders established, Fisher wrote on May 19th, 2024. But if you will not accept the reality that this is long gone, if you judge others based on fidelity to a set of principles, he puts in air quotes, that govern no one, then you are a fool. End quotation. This is quite a summation of the perspective that I've seen a good number of folks articulate in the last few years, namely that the U.S. Constitution is dead. It no longer governs anyone. The left no longer recognizes it. And so basically the argument goes, conservatives and Christians should stop trying to act as if the Constitution still matters. It doesn't matter. We are over here in a corner clinging to our precious dead document that nobody is recognizing. And so what we should do, the argument often goes, is we should recognize that the public square is a place where power dynamics are played out, and we should embrace various forms of critical theory, and we should play power ball. We should play hardball in the public.
So I got to pause right there. The idea that we're embracing elements of critical theory is just complete nonsense. I think there's some elements of classical liberalism that try to invent political rules and dynamics that don't exist and have never really existed, but we're pretending like they exist to our own demise.
Oh,
But the idea that
number one being neutrality as a
yes,
concept.
so critical theorists don't believe in neutrality. Well, that's not necessarily, that doesn't mean we're embracing elements of critical theory. That just means that we're not that the critical theorists actually understand politics better than the classical liberals, which is actually really sad. But it would also that also would illustrate why critical theory was so successful in penetrating our politics, is because they were actually more adhering to the natural rules of politics within a republic, whereas the classical liberals were pretending that certain sets of rules exist that do not exist. And I want to say, like, the quality of this video is kind of bad on my end, and I don't think that's just me. I think that's on him. I'm just saying. So if it sounds like that he's recording with a potato or something, I don't know what to tell you. Uh, Again, he does not have a large YouTube presence. We have more subscribers than he does. So yay. And definitely subscribe to the Evangelical Dark Web to keep it that way. But I don't know if you had anything else to add on that.
I mean, yeah, the whole critical theory, I mean, it's kind of ridiculous because the basic claims of critical race theory or whatever are functionally false. And they, of course, assert like the oppression dynamics. But at the end of the day, America was, the Anglo-Protestant project. So you're basically saying that the people that, the heritage Americans that created the country are the oppressors. Well, they built the country. So the idea of, their descendants, so to speak, rising up and saying, hey, this is our country. Our forefathers built it. And, it's kind of like Ireland for the Irish or Ausländer Rose in Germany. I hope I pronounced that right. But, is that critical theory that they're saying, hey, Germany is for the Germans or Ireland is for the Irish?
America is for the Americans. Self-determination used to mean something, right? But that's like a rehash of World War I history. So just wanted to point that out.
Other than that, he actually didn't do a bad job articulating that, hey, his opponents actually want to wield power and win elections and actually achieve something through policy.
I don't know if you can pull up the Jonathan Benton. Okay, yes, it came up. Jonathan says, leveling the charge of the right adhering to critical theory seems merely like the tone policing of the right by big/mid-Eva. And I think that's pretty fair. Again, it's part tone policing, but it's part, power is the government is a sword and it has to be wielded. The idea that the critical theorists want to wield the sword of government and then these Christian nationalists also want to wield the sword of government does not mean that they're embracing elements of critical theory. It just means that you're inept. Like if there's a war going on, you're not embracing elements of the other side to fight back.
Well, I mean, and he has to actually and I probably assume he does not do this, but you have to actually establish the fact that the Constitution is still enforced today. And
Maybe he will.
And I feel like he doesn't, but because I think someone else has reacted to it, and I think they call him Owen Strawman for a reason. So.
Will he be that bad? Well, just find out after these messages. No, I'm just kidding. We don't have sponsors tonight.
Square. And as conservatives, we should simply seek to win. We shouldn't try then to point people back to these lofty principles of oneness in humanity and equality before the law and religious liberty and freedom of speech and freedom to believe as you see fit, freedom of conscience most broadly in America. None of those realities holds water in the broader public debate anymore. And so it's argued in the Christian world and again in the conservative space as well. We shouldn't try to keep pointing people to this pristine document that we nostalgically, that's Fisher's word that he just used in that tweet that I quoted, that we nostalgically think still matters. The Constitution doesn't matter anymore. Stop it, is what the Christian nationalists are telling us in the evangelical world. Stop acting as if this document still matters. Stop acting as if there are principles of America's founding that you can take people back to. Stop educating young people in the Constitution and some kind of respect for the public order that was created in America by those principles. We instead actually have an opportunity.
I'm going to pause right there because that to me was a complete straw man. Like he wasn't representing the actual position of Nate Fisher at all. So that's kind of, to me, I thought that was kind of pathetic on.
Well, I mean, and who's the one doing
part.
and again, if you look at him and I think I won't say Hillsdale, but Hillsdale has their whole, take a course on the Constitution. And I think a lot of these organizations that want to basically just Constitution coach people is that the Constitution will save the day. If you hold up the Constitution in front of you that, the bad things that are happening will automatically cease to happen. I mean, that's kind of the. I mean, he's kind of describing them, and how has that actually worked out? How is arguing the Constitution says this actually helped?
Well, again, even the Maryland Constitution says that the government can't suspend freedom in times of war or other pleas of necessity, was not able to stop Larry Hogan from locking down the state. So what did the Constitution of Maryland do to protect the rights, or the Maryland Declaration of Rights, as it's called, do to protect the rights? It didn't do anything, because at the end of the day, they needed a judge to agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, the Constitution means what what the majority of 9 justices says it means. That's how we got gay marriage. That's how we got transgenderism. That's how we got abortion. That's how we got, the removal of federalism, because the Supreme Court said, hey, federalism doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, I mean, they basically said that a president's subordinates can, do whatever they want. Yeah, and they can disobey direct orders in a chain of command. So,
because of mean tweets.
Well, right. Isn't that what the citizenship question involved? But either way, I think. And Biden's going around delegitimizing the Supreme Court by, with the college loan forgiveness. He's just openly defying the Supreme Court, which I believe Oren McIntyre pointed out was their way of delegitimizing the Supreme Court if and when the Supreme Court exonerates Trump and overrules that conviction. So they're already playing a longer game here. And, they're doing what Trump should have done, which is defy the courts. Which
again, that's
never would
basically the strategy. Like, I don't think Mr. Strawman is going to point it out, but if you remove your reverence for the Constitution, then that means you'll actually start using policies and procedures that'll work, which includes nullification, a decentralization of government, i.e., the states asserting more power, and then obviously bucking the courts. So those are 3 strategies that would and use of executive orders.
And
so you have 3 or 4 strategies that would essentially be weapons, arrows in your quiver that Owen Strachan, if you did Mr. Constitution, would say, yeah, you can't do that. Constitution says.
Here's my frustration, because I'm active in politics locally. And the people who believe in constitutioning harder, they oppose Article 5 Convention of States as a means to Constitution. They think that is off limits to use Article 5 to bring reforms to the government. They think Article 5 Convention of States off limits. They do not support it. It's like, you guys support the Constitution, but you don't support using the Constitution to save the Constitution. It is confusing to me, because again, the runaway convention argument, it does not hold water, because all the states would have to ratify whatever runaway constitution comes up because of the amendment process. So I don't think that argument holds up at all. So those are my thoughts. Let's get through this.
Nationalists tell us to dynamite this whole liberal foundation. This whole thing wasn't a good idea anyway. This is a form of how the argument goes. Instead, if you want a stable nation, you have to build it on biblical grounds. You basically have to take people back to the old covenant law. That's the grounds we should build this order back upon. Or others in the CN world will say we have freedom to reestablish this public order in a fusion of good ideas and biblical principles. Basically, what is called for is the establishment of a Christian prince, some kind of major heroic figure in a Washingtonian frame. I saw Joe Rigney argue for this recently. We need a George Washington-esque figure who will come back and can be a kind of benevolent dictator of America and get this country back on the rails. The Constitution, calling people back to those principles, again, that's not cutting it. So what we need is a strong man. We need a strong political figure. We need a Christian prince type of man. And that leader can come back, take the reins, probably rule in kind of a very strong way, almost an authoritarian way, but he'll govern according to the Bible generally. And that will mean then that all this liberal experiment we've had the last several hundred years in America and in Europe over the last millennium, roughly, all of that can end. And now what we can do is stop pretending that extra biblical government works, and we can do biblical government again. And that is going to solve the problems before us. That is going to restore order. We're going to recover our nation. It's going to be, of course, formally a Christian nation. There will be, according to Stephen Wolfe, as he wrote in his famous book, one or at most two ethnicities that dominate America. And that will mean that we'll have, again, a kind of stable body politic, united by bloodline, at least substantially. And in that respect, we will achieve a solid and stable public order once again. If you don't
So that was a mouthful. You have any thoughts on that?
I mean, let's begin with the fact that he's critiquing how we got here, and that's because the Constitution has more or less ran its course. We've seen the experiment play out for, since 1789, and the Constitution has subsequently been eroded. Federalism has essentially been dismantled. The franchise has been diluted to now pretty much, illegals can vote, and they still want to expand the franchise to DC and to
Puerto Rico.
Puerto Rico. I was also going to say into like under 18. I think they're like, you have all these desperate push, I guess, movements to expand the franchise even further. So that's, again, those are three ways that the Constitution has been subverted through the amendment process for the most part. But yeah, the ideas have failed. Like, the whole notion of John Adams saying, Constitution's for a moral and religious people. Well, what happens if the country is no longer that moral and religious people? Then the Constitution cannot properly govern.
It's ironic that I've seen anti-Christian nationalists quote that, and they're quoting it unironically. And I don't know why, because, do you honestly think we have that virtue in our society right now? Or are you saying we need to get that virtue as a prerequisite for saving America? I don't know, but I don't think it's very strong or compelling.
So the first complaint is that liberalism is how we got here. I mean, that's blank slate theory. That's,
The idea that liberalism goes back 1,000 years, though, what was up with him and, labeling of centuries? For several centuries. America hasn't been around for several centuries.
I think he's trying to, I don't know. But blank slate, unchosen bonds or liberation from unchosen bonds. So all these liberal ideas are how we got here. And the second part is we got to point out that he kind of he misunderstands what Caesareanism is, and the idea that we have a currently dysfunctional and morally decadent society. That's a right breeding ground for a Caesarean type figure. That because people are so incompetent, someone is going to step up and fill the void. That's one potential scenario that could, and that's what a lot of people see in Trump is he is the Caesarean type figure because he's, actually wanting to stand up and challenge the power.
I mean, again, my biggest frustration with Trump is that he's not a Julius Caesar. And
he's not the monster people said he was, and I wish he was.
I mean, Octavian was really the monster, but Baron Trump's 18 years old. We can't wait that long, and Trump's other sons are too gay. So let's be real that they're not real successors here. Baron Trump's too young. We can't wait that long for Octavian Trump here.
I mean, at least he brought up George Washington instead of Protestant Franco, because Stephen Wolfe describes George Washington as the Christian prince, and or at least he did on this live stream and others. And of course, the third part we got to address is he doesn't seem to understand what ethnogenesis is, and if you have a stable population demographically, that it tends to create uniting bonds. You can't just flood the country with immigrants and expect social trust not to decrease.
Right. I mean, let's say we cap immigration for 100 years. No one's allowed to immigrate to the United States. That would result in a more ethnogenesis over time. Is kind of the argument that Stephen Wolfe seems to be alluding to.
Well, yeah, that's what a nation is. It's a people in a place. It's
not again, an idea. Anglos and Saxons were once separate ethnicities. but now they're all lumped in together with the British. So it happens.
I mean, even
Except the reality.
Oh,
I was gonna
yeah.
say, like, even a lot of the black slaves were probably from different tribes, but over the 400 years of slavery or whatever, they all kind of merged into one, I guess, ethnicity, so to speak.
I think it was like 200 years of slavery, but like,
Yeah,
Reality
give or take.
that the Constitution is outmoded and there is a need for this Christian nationalist vision, then according to Nate Fisher himself, you are a fool. You are living in nostalgia. You long to restore these halcyon principles that once held sway but no longer have any effect. In fact, that vision of a constitutional republic governed by principles that are held by diverse peoples, including peoples who have disagreement on a lot of matters, including religiously, that vision is no longer governing anyone. So give that all up, kiss your nostalgic vision goodbye, and instead come back to reality and build the Christian nation. The Constitution is a dead letter. There's a lot to say in response to this vision, but fundamentally from the outset here, I'm going to take the opposite standpoint. I'm going to argue, I believe, that though America is in a rough place today, no one's confused about that, the Constitution is not outmoded. We should not give up on the Constitution. We should not give up on the democratic principles of America. We should continue teaching American civics to our children. Yes, the left is playing hardball and power politics and causing absolute mayhem in this country. That is definitely true. But the solution to that very bad situation is not to abandon the idea of a free society and put it under the guise of a Christian society that is effectively an authoritarian society. That is not what we are called to go back and do. We are not in anywhere in Scripture called to go back and bring Old Covenant Israel back into being, for example, or take the theonomistic structure of Old Covenant Israel and impose it upon nation states today. There is absolutely no call in the New Testament upon the church to do that. The apostle.
To my knowledge, or Stephen Wolfe is not a theonomist.
No,
right?
And that's because he believes in the principle of particularity, and that
And
each nation would have different policies, different laws, things that tailor to their specific culture. Again, he actually writes about this in his book, and again, he would allude to John Calvin, who would also have a strong, I guess, semblance of particularity within his work, because he doesn't assume that all kings will enact the same laws regarding even the first table of the commandments.
and Nate Woods is basically making the point that I'm about to make, and that conflating Christian nationalism with theonomy is annoying and a big problem with these medieval types continue to make. And that is especially true when they conflate Christian nationalism also with postmillennialism, because theonomy and postmillennialism kind of go together. But again, I think Christian nationalism is actually superior to theonomy. And one reason is that Christian nationalism is much better on the issue of immigration. I think it's very obvious that there are much stronger grounds to limit immigration under Christian nationalism than under theonomy. And that's kind of been pointed out by, like Neil Shenvi types and stuff like that. But also a lot of theonomists have historically been very libertarian when it comes to the border. So that's one issue. Crime, I think, is another issue where Christian nationalism is superior. A lot of theonomists want to reinvent the criminal justice system to, get rid of jails and prisons. I don't think that's necessarily biblical because there are jails in the Bible. But one thing that, look at Bukele in El Salvador. He did mass incarceration of gangsters.
He violated civil liberties, by the way, to do that.
Exactly. He did mass incarceration of gangsters to get rid of all the gangbangers, and then put them in prison. A theonomist that wouldn't really fly under theonomy.
Well, I'd ask Owen Strand, how does the democratic process resolve $30 trillion in debt that is ballooning $1 trillion per quarter? Like, that's a debt spiral. That is a financial collapse in the works.
So Andrew says that Christian nationalism is the logical next step of theonomy. I might argue that Christian nationalism is actually older than theonomy.
Yeah, I mean,
especially when Stephen Wolfe is drawing it to the reformers, and he's drawing a case from there. So
the modern theonomy, I think, is a lot of like Rushdoony,
Rushdoony, yeah.
and yeah, they take the word general equity from the Westminster Confession, but
All right, let's get through this.
yeah,
apostles do not advocate for such a vision. They do not press for it. They do not urge the church to bring back the nation state of the Old Covenant era. There's actually, as we're going to see later on in this episode, a fair bit of apostolic flexibility in the form of government that the apostles champion by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. But at the outset, again, under this first response to this idea that we should give up on the Constitution, I repeat myself. It is not mere nostalgia. It is not Constitution worship, to use a phrase I saw elsewhere on social media recently that characterizes the position of someone like me, that is causing us to say, no, let's keep fighting. It's not worshiping this document. It's not having, grandpa-like nostalgia for the America that used to be. We are a nation founded upon documents. And if you take away that foundation, what is left? So there is this kind of easy button to push that is offered us by the Christian nationalist crowd. But as I'm now at pains to say, we should not push that button. We should hold the line. We should continue, even in much darkness, to work for the good of the city where we find ourselves. We are not called to, again, impose Old Testament law on people around us. We are called instead to seek to be salt and light, Matthew 5:13 and 14, right where we are now. That is our current call. Hey, we'll be back to the conversation in just a minute, but I need to talk to you about something very important. We believe in the sanctity of told this. We have no call.
He has sponsors, dude. Has less than 5,000 subs. Can I get some sponsors?
Gold? Was that gold too?
I don't know. I'm not gonna give him I'm not gonna give him that.
I'm just saying, gold relies on selling a financial collapse, which America is headed towards.
Again, I'm not. Whoever got rich by investing in gold, that's not where I'm putting my money in. But that's another topic for another day. So, wow, he just totally did that to us. But anyway, it sounded like he was again trying to conflate different ideas, and what's left, Americans, and I think Bishop pointed out quite well. And it's like, yeah, we are still a people and a place. We are more than the customs that were normalized, because again, the Constitution first starts out with a lot of underlying principles that are then codified. They might be codified because they're being threatened, but they're nonetheless normative principles that the culture widely believed. Like, these were cultural norms that the early Americans believed. So I don't think that's a particularly strong argument that he's making, because at the end of the day, he's saying that we exist for the Constitution, that America exists for the Constitution, not the Constitution existing for the United States.
Jesus said something similar, right? The Sabbath
Sabbath, yeah.
I think man was made for the Sabbath just as man was made for the Constitution.
Exactly. The American man was made for the Constitution. It's such a bad argument.
And again,
to abandon.
We're not giving up on the Constitution to say, hey, throw it away. We're actually saying, hey, we can't, abide by this. We
can't Constitution our way out of this.
Yes. You actually have to play politics by the rules of politics. You actually have to just wield power if you have power.
And, the Constitution's not going to come to save us. There's in conservatism in general, so much of the logic is, if we, we'll have our day in court and we'll win in court. And that's just not, I don't think it's very good thinking that we can just sue and sue and sue, because that takes a lot of money and that takes a lot of time.
I mean, Michael Cassidy learned the lesson. I mean, yeah, basically they're willing to make him spend $100,000 just to defend himself, which was like $800 fine and 2 years of probation. That's what they made him spend all that money for. It's a war of attrition. And they have the state. They have the unlimited deep pockets of the state.
Right.
Our current government. Think of what Peter says in 1 Peter 2:13-17. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors is sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. As some of you out there will know, Peter is likely writing this under Emperor Nero, one of the most wicked rulers the world has ever known. But he notably says in 1 Peter 2:17, honor the emperor. That is absolutely revolutionary, but not in the direction of fomenting revolution, actually in the direction of being subject to the government. Let me say a couple qualifiers here before we continue on looking at this passage. First, we need to say this. There are instances where governments overreach, and if Christians have agency, they do not have to follow wicked decrees that cause them to go against their conscience. I very much believe this. So the principle I would offer you here in terms of how far this subjection or submission to government goes is this. We submit to our given government as much as we possibly can. That's the principle. So you're not seeking to be disobedient and rebellious in a fundamental way as a believer wherever you find yourself in this world. You are seeking to model a form of subjection or submission to authority, recognizing that God is the one who has established government. God has not only established Israel as a nation, but God has established civil government in general. And in fact, civil government, as we're going to see, is not appointed by God following the era of Old Covenant Israel to be what the church is in the New Covenant. You must not confuse, in biblical and theological terms, the God-appointed civil government over all nations with the church. The two are not the same. The mission of the state is not the same as the mission of the church. There are distinct missions. I am not here articulating a hard form of what is called two kingdoms theology, where the church says, what you just said, Strachan, that's true. And so that means we just do our churchy stuff. We don't run for office. We don't even really get involved in the affairs of our nation or even our community. What we do is we just gather as the church, and that's our political statement. Jesus is Lord, and that's all we do. I am something of a proponent of what you could call a two kingdoms view, but I also veer into Kuyperian territory, and I want Christians to recognize that God has established different spheres of authority, and I want believers to cross the boundaries and be salt and light, to use that again, wherever we can be. So I don't think we are called only to gather as Christians in local churches, and that's all our public witness is. That is a vital form of our public witness, but we also press into all corners of our society and culture in order to bring the gospel and biblical truth to bear on our surroundings, as much as God allows, as much as God blesses. So an example of someone who fits that bill in historical terms would be a William Wilberforce in the 18th and 19th centuries, famously the one who most campaigns against slavery and the slave trade, and in God's kind providence ends up bringing down both through decades-long labors. I believe that Wilberforce...
Correction, he brought down slavery in mainland Britain, not in the empire, but, I'll let him finish.
Not a perfect man, of course, just like me, was one who faithfully lived out Christian citizenship in this evil world. He crossed the boundaries. He didn't just show up to church in the Anglican Communion. He also served in Parliament for decades and decades, and not only served, but actively championed legislation that brought the end of horrific evil in the world and liberated many people. And so Wilberforce accomplished tremendous good by the kind working of God. So I do hold to the mission of the state being different from the mission of the church, both being established by God, even as I do not stop there, but say, yes, our congregational worship is a political statement. Jesus is the true king. Absolutely. Jesus is the true Lord of the earth. Caesar is not. No Caesar is. No earthly ruler is. No body of rulers is. But also you want Christians to be involved as much as they possibly can in their context. That's not going to look the same for all of us, by the way. All of us are not called to run for office or something like this, but I believe some of us are. The second thing to say...
So let's pause right there. I just want to interrupt to say that what he just said was a truism. Like, no one's really disputing this. And I'm glad that he said much of what he said, that Christians should be involved. Again, not
But he's actually saying they shouldn't.
no, he's
At
now
the
he's going to
at
say
the
the rule.
time,
There are special rules of engagement that we're now bind to.
which I mean,
So
first of all, I mean Stephen Wolfe is classical two kingdoms, and second of all the like if you look back, to the reformers. I mean, I think Martin Luther had three estates, which was basically sphere sovereignty. Obviously, Calvin. Then you go to Rutherford. All these people would say that the government should enforce first and second table of the law, and that's without saying that the government is tasked with doing the job of the church. Like he's making a straw man of saying that Christian nationalists are saying the government should be the church, and the church should be the government. Not that even though everyone and all theological
and
forefathers
one of the
assumed
reasons why
spirit sovereignty.
it's a straw man is because Christian nationalists would largely agree with what he said there. Maybe you get into the weeds on the two kingdom versus one kingdom stuff. I can't really say I see the biblical evidence of two kingdoms. I just kind of don't. I think it's just all one. Maybe that's just me, but I don't know. It seems more like a logical extrapolation than theology proper. That's just me.
In response to questions about what it means to be a Christian in submission to your government, is that the American founding is nothing if not a revolution of government, and there is a long-standing tradition of debate in historical and intellectual circles and even theological circles over the American founding. Was it right that the colonists revolted against Great Britain? There's a widespread, wide-ranging, and quite hot controversy that you can enter into. It's a profitable debate. I see arguments on both sides. I do not see script.
Since when is this a hot debate? Is he just
I
going
mean,
off
John
of John
MacArthur,
MacArthur?
yeah. But at the same time, the grievances that the current government has inflicted upon the people were far more severe than anything the colonists went through.
I don't know.
I mean, they literally made mass injected poison into their people.
Yeah.
Scripture summoning the colonists automatically to a posture of rebellion against Great Britain, but I do also understand that there were real injustices committed against the American colonists by their mother country. I'm not going to try to resolve that in this episode of Grace and Truth. I will simply say people will pose that question to someone like me, going to a text like 1 Peter 2, 13 to 17, and what I'm going to say is not going to be an automatic whole-scale defense along biblical lines of the American Revolution. I'm going to say that is a very complex matter, and we can sort that out. We, however, are not in 1772 or 1776 or 1780. That's not us. We are living here in 2024. Whatever you conclude about the American Revolution right now, when we look at Scripture, we have no call to abandon our current government. We are not summoned by Peter, who was living under basically dictatorial reign in the first century Greco-Roman world, to upend the current public order and create an entirely new one. There's not a call to revolution in that sense.
So again, this is someone who says that they understand sphere sovereignty, but at the end of the day, maybe they don't. And the idea is the doctrine of lesser magistrates. The idea that the American Revolution was done through lesser magistrates. It was the
Well,
lesser magistrates and the colonial governments
I mean, it's
that
not even a
seceded from
revolution.
the UK.
It's not really a revolution. It's more of just a war for secession. And that's, I think, an important distinction.
And
We call it a revolution for whatever reason.
along those lines, what about the South?
Yeah,
And
that was
that if there is a secession of a state, which magistrate do you go with?
And I mean, the South wasn't even a civil war because they weren't trying to fight for the government. They were trying to secede. Again, it's a war of secession.
Again,
but he actually basically says that the colonists were under more strict tyranny then than America is right now. He is making that case.
Now, again, I think that it should be done via local powers standing up to the government. I think that is the best way that it works. A popular peasant revolt doesn't really work. We saw that in France. And guess what happened? Napoleon, a lesser magistrate, came in and saved the day. So that's kind of what happened in France. and then the day was lost again. But
Yeah.
nonetheless,
I mean, let me make the point that like Sam Rutherford talks about how the king giving away the land of the people and giving away giving away the nation to like foreigners is actually like a cause for rebellion, and that's certainly what our government has done is they've given away the nation to foreigners.
again, I don't think it would be justified to rebel unless a state takes up the mantle. A state should do it. And then if a state does it, then you got the Civil War movie that they just came out with. But that would be it. That would be the pathway.
You can start asking questions along the lines of Romans 13, for example, of what happens when the government is actively calling good evil and evil good and these sorts of things. And that's where some people will find their way to a case for revolution from the scripture. Again, a lively debate. I understand it. I recognize it. I'm glad to have it in that sense. But what I think the church's primary mission in this world is not to be those who revolt against government, but to be those who are submitting to government, even evil government, as much as is humanly possible. That's what Peter says to do. This is the will of God, he says in verse 15, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. So we're not supposed to be anarchists fundamentally. Someone will say to me, yeah, but aren't you leaving some room when a government does flip and go completely evil? Aren't you leaving room for Christians to take action in some sense? I am. I do. I think I have that category. I do have that category, but I can't tell you where the line is in perfect biblical precision. I can only say that the early church was called by an apostle, speaking under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, to bear up under tremendous pressure and be faithful and live in a very difficult context for the glory of God. And that is fundamentally our marching orders, not to revolt. Could there be a place for Christians taking action against wicked government? There could be. But fundamentally, is that our normative call? No, it is not. Our normative call is to be faithful in good, medium, or bad circumstances.
And it's worth noting that the entire book of Judges is kind of about, the cycle of, conquering and then getting conquered and then leading a revolt against being conquered. So, there's a lot of revolts in the book of Judges.
I mean, again, it is clear he just doesn't understand what time it is. And the whole debate he is trying to have about the Constitution is he's trying to say you can still play by the rules as they're written and work, Constitution harder. And, I guess the Christian nationalists are pretty much saying, yeah, the Constitution doesn't work and you just got to acquire power and wield it against your opposition. Which strategy is going to win? And he seems to prefer like the strategy of impotence, which got us here, which rather than actually try something that works.
I mean, he's trying to, I guess, go after explain doctrine of lesser magistrates in a debate about whether we're still living in the constitutional order.
And let's be clear. I mean,
object to relevance
by discarding the Constitution and all the reverence and the nostalgia, you are actually able to avert war and violence and disorder. Like, this is how you avert a civil war. This is how you avert violence on the street. Because, again, the government is essentially allowing anarcho-tyranny to take hold in every American city. Like, there's not one safe city in America that's, like, livable.
So, all right, let's continue. We're halfway through it, guys.
And it concerns me that people are saying, well, today we live in trash world, to use the formulation of Andrew Torba, for example. We're in trash world. And so what we should do is just hit eject on all of this whole order. It stinks. It's bad. And we should just opt out of it, basically, and build something new. If there ever was, air quotes, a trash world, it was first century Rome. The Roman Empire was not a picnic to live in particular, if you crossed swords with it.
Again, does this guy even history? They were living during the Pax Romana. Like Nero was bad and Caligula was bad, but like most of the other emperors were pretty good during that time.
Given Roman emperor was not pleased with the church, there was an excellent chance in 5 different waves of persecution that you as a born-again believer would lose your head. Many of the apostles were killed for their Christian confession and Christian witness. And so you would expect, if it is right to reject a fallen order and foment revolution and create something new, you would expect that it would be the apostles who are living with a sword at their throat, much of their ministries, who would be the ones who would call us to do that. But that is not the model of Paul in the book of Acts, nor in his epistles, and that is not what Peter tells us to adopt as our fundamental posture in his letter, 1 Peter. Instead, you're actually supposed to see in normal terms, choosing my language carefully here with appropriate nuance and qualification, suffering as an opportunity for gospel advance. If the government says don't worship Christ, you cannot worship Christ, you don't follow that. You don't obey that. And there's more to that discussion as well.
So did Owen Strand lock down his church in 2020?
Well, this is kind of where I just want to say a lot of these people just aren't suffering at all. I mean, I'm sure they have houses. I'm sure they have, with actually affordable mortgages too. I'm sure they have nice cars. I'm sure they have thriving families. Like they're not suffering from the consequences of, what's actually coming in terms of the financial chaos that is afflicting our country. Like they're not suffering the consequences of these bad decisions. Odds are they probably don't live in diverse neighborhoods. So they're not dealing with the crime and the immigration problem at their doorstep.
But they want to, get white people out of the churches often. Because again, Owen Strand was super woke back in the day.
But here he is talking about suffering. It's it's kind of like David Platt talking about giving away all your money and the radical gospel. And
are you serious? Because that's literally the chapter of Radical that I'm on. So I'm currently reading Radical by David Platt. It'll come in handy for when I write about David Platt. And I'm on the chapter about, the starving child in Africa argument. That's the current chapter of Radical I'm on. And yeah, you're not wrong. It is, I believe, the longest chapter in the book. So.
Yeah, but that's pretty much him talking about suffering. Is David Platt talking about the poverty gospel.
Right.
But in normative terms, you bear up under suffering, you persevere under suffering, you don't opt out and say, I'm not doing this. You live in that world as a gospel witness. Hey, got to jump out of our conversation for just a minute.
Oh, come on, Owen Strand. Hillsdale College.
Of Churchill explores how Winston Churchill armed today.
Got to go when the outfit changes.
Well,
he was doing a Winston Churchill thing.
Self-paced, so that you could start whenever and wherever you fall asleep. Hillsdale.edu/ to change where you live. Can you move to a different state? Can you move to a more free state over a less free one? You can, absolutely. I'm not binding people with a new law that would say you have to suffer as much as humanly possible for as long as humanly possible in order to glorify Christ. There's a lot of gray area there. I'm just trying to do justice to what the Bible teaches us, and the Bible teaches us that in normal terms we should be submissive to authority. Our third response to the idea that we should abandon the Constitution is this. Paul drew on his citizenship. He didn't repudiate it. He drew on it. Paul, the Apostle Paul, could have said, Rome is so evil that it's trash world, and I just reject it, and it just all stinks without any nuance or any qualification, the way lots of professing Christian leaders are speaking today. It just all stinks. Look, they're transing our kids and the whole thing is bad and there's no good left in this world and nobody's living by the Constitution and so we're just abandoning the whole thing. That is a profoundly unqualified perspective. There can be value in broad brush approaches like that, but you should be careful about them because we're being led, or at least figures are trying to lead us today, who don't think in a careful, qualified way, even as they stand for bold truth. Instead, they're packaging a vision of the West They're selling it to us with basically no nuance. If you nuance their vision, in fact, you're effeminate and you're basically a liberal and you're a cuck or these sorts of things. And they're telling us if you don't go with our vision, you're nostalgic and you're not recognizing that the Constitution is dead. We need to be very careful about this approach, though. Forget the advance of the gospel for a minute. Just think about the state of America. There's a lot of bad happening in America. That's where I would agree with some on the CN side. But there's also a fair bit of good happening here. And before we give up on the whole thing, we need to acknowledge that we still have a lot of liberty. We still have a lot of freedom. We still have a lot of judges out there who continue to rule justly, at least in some sense. We still have a lot of legislators and lawmakers who are at some level a voice for what is good and true. We still have a lot of churches here. We still have a lot of constitutional freedoms here. They have not all been taken away. We are not in the worst possible nation imaginable. And it's reasons like this that make me very concerned about believers who are listening to popular podcasts, coming to the conclusion that we just live in trash world, we live in this terrible place, the Constitution's dead, and then they immediately turn to a call to revolution or a call to Christianize America and give up on our founding principles. And I have major...
What are our founding principles?
I mean, our founding principles.
He said it, and then he just quickly moved away from that. What are our founding principles? Pluralism? Is that what he's going to say? So here's the problem. His second argument, he's on his third argument, was submitting to authority, and he talked a lot about that. Is the Constitution our authority? Is it the governor or president? Which one's our authority? So that needs to be hashed out.
I mean, you did have a lot of people that were like, "Oh, the Constitution is our authority because it says we the people," and that's supposed to be, self-evident that it is authority. And again, it doesn't matter what he says about the judges, the liberty, the freedoms. I mean,
again,
they're going to make you spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to assert your rights, to assert your freedom. I mean, how much did John MacArthur spend to keep his church open? Even the Attilas who just got off on his, who just won in court.
Gym owner in New Jersey.
Yes, Attilas gym in New Jersey. He still spent how much money? The process is the punishment. Even if you win in court,
Jack Dempsey in Colorado.
Yeah,
how much money did that guy spend?
The process is the punishment.
Yeah,
I mean, in a sense, make Paul go to Rome. Make him ball and chain with under house arrest. Make that happen. That's pretty much what the spirit of the age is like. Yeah.
Now Paul did that because he was trying to save his life from a hit job.
Yeah, from getting killed by the Jays. And it was either, be on the, get street justice or get Caesar justice. And, Caesar was more equitable.
Exactly.
But at the same time, that's what they wanted. Make him use his citizens.
And my understanding is Paul got off when he appealed to Rome, but he would later be killed. Right.
Yeah. But, the process was in itself the punishment. He still had to go to Rome, face the trial, face trial number one, face imprisonment number one, and then get off. So he still had to endure all that suffering. And again, that included a shipwreck and getting bit by the snake, I think happened then. So it wasn't exactly a cakewalk.
Yeah. So there's the idea, he talked about submitting to authority, but he hasn't clearly defined what the authority is in the United States. He talked about, there's a lot of good judges out there. There really aren't, first of all. And again, what institution has eroded the Constitution more than the courts? So
often in the name of liberty.
Yes.
And freedom. So
concerns with that. People all around us are basically punting on their citizenship in practical terms. Here's what Paul said in Acts 22, 25 and following, when he gets maligned for preaching the gospel. But when they had stretched him out for the whips, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, "Is it lawful for you to flog a man who is a Roman citizen and uncondemned?" When the centurion heard this, he went to the tribune and said to him, "What are you about to do? For this man is a Roman citizen." So the tribune came and said to him, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" And he, Paul, said, "Yes." The tribune answered, "I bought this citizenship for a large sum." Paul said, "I am a citizen by birth. Paul drew on his Roman citizenship. He didn't repudiate it. He nowhere in the book of Acts calls for rebellion or revolution against Rome. He easily could. He also nowhere, as he engages numerous rulers and leaders, governors in the book of Acts, tries to impose old covenant, what you could call civil law upon those contexts. He nowhere calls for that. Instead, he preaches the gospel and preaches the whole counsel of God. So the Apostle Paul does not offer the model that some would like him to offer. Instead, he continues to honor the citizenship that God has providentially given him by birth. I think that's very important.
Just a quick interruption. Didn't John the Baptist basically lose his head? Well, technically he lost his head because of a sexualized birthday dance, but he was in prison because he was basically trying to impose some Old Testament morality. You can't just marry your brother's wife.
Well, I mean, Romans 13 calls the magistrate as ministers of God, so therefore they are expected to uphold God's law, and their authority is legitimate in the eyes of God insofar as they do. When Herod is killing John the Baptist, he is not acting as king of Israel or whatever his title was. He is acting as Herod, the sinner.
Now, interesting.
So his authority to kill John the Baptist was not the authority granted to him by God as a magistrate.
Now, there's a Herod that Paul preached the gospel to, and that Herod was almost amenable to the gospel, if you recall in Acts. And then Paul was able to preach the gospel to, the emperor, perhaps. We don't, get that far in Acts because it has a very abrupt ending. But the idea is, if, say, the King Herod in earlier in Acts, and then say whatever emperor that he talked to converted, would they not have been eager to have imposed Christian morality in their conversion, in their job? Would they not have been eager as a response to the gospel to impose a more biblical morality on the rest of the empire? History tells us that when leaders come to Christ, that's kind of what happens. Tiridates III in Armenia, the first ever Christian nation. So,
I mean, when he was arrested in the
Edict of Milan by Emperor Constantine, which didn't make Christianity the official religion of Rome. That would happen much later, but nonetheless, it was a much more biblical situation.
I mean, he got off when he asserted his citizenship after the jailer converted, but at the same time, they had no problem abusing his rights. And I'm sure, on his way to the jail cell, he was probably asserting his citizenship, which they didn't really care or believe. So, but they only really believed him after the jailer pretty much helped him out.
Right. So we got 13 minutes left, guys, and maybe one sponsorship.
For us today, because we are being basically told to give up on our citizenship, at least in normative terms, to give up on what it has commonly meant to be an American and to re-envision that in a totally new direction. And what I would say is, I think we should be wary of that approach. I think we should think very hard about how the Apostle Paul engages his citizenship and see that as a model for us. We have been providentially given citizenship in a country that has many faults and many weaknesses, much like ancient Rome did. And yet, the Apostle Paul did not say, hey, Rome is persecuting me. Rome is basically, in so many actions, trying to kill me. Paul is eventually going to be martyred by Rome. And so, this republic has lost its warrant to govern. It's wicked and evil, and let's just turn our backs on it. And let's be like the anarchists. By the way, in the first century context, the apostles and biblical authors and Jesus himself would have known, they did know, at least some of them, about anarchists in their time. And they did not speak like the anarchists spoke. They did not write out the same political philosophy in different New Testament documents that anarchists would have articulated. There were many who tried to foment revolution against Rome. And that is not what Jesus and his apostles do. This is an important subject that is underemphasized today, but the gospel does not create anarchy. The gospel does not cause us in a kind of quick trigger form to be revolutionaries. The gospel caused Paul to honor his Roman citizenship and use it for the extension of his life and the promotion of the gospel. And if that doesn't wrap up every question neatly in a bow that we face in political philosophy in our context, it does definitely at least lay some ground for us to say, perhaps I should not quickly or easily give up on my prerogatives of citizenship, even if I am in a context where I grieve a lot of what is going on.
Okay, was anything like that was just straw man city there?
I mean, can we just point out that you're not a citizen of the U.S. Constitution? You're a citizen of the United States of America.
No one is saying to not use your citizenship to the full extent that you can. If anything, we're actually saying that voting is the bare minimum of citizenship.
Yeah, but your citizenship is not to a document; it's to a nation.
Well, yeah, that's
It's basically
certainly
saying you're part of a people and a place.
so he doesn't know what a nation is, which is why he doesn't really understand the concept of citizenship that he's invoking here.
Paul wasn't saying I'm a member of the Roman Constitution, in the Roman Senate. No, he was saying I am a Roman citizen by birth.
Everything that he's saying here is far more relevant lecturing his fellow Anabaptists. And you're a historic premillennialist, and I specify historic and not dispensational because, again, the Anabaptists were the baddies back then. Well, they were the ones fomenting revolution.
Yeah, who were the anarchists? I'm pretty sure they took over Jerusalem in around 70 AD.
Exactly, and they were the abomination of desolation, right? So that that was brought to an end in some ways. So. And that was your sign to flee. Jerusalem was the revolution that took place. So, I think in that case, there is a sense in where early Christians were actually siding with the lesser of two evils, and that was Rome, and not, the Maccabee wannabes in Jerusalem and Masada. So, I just thought nothing he said there was relevant to Christian nationalists because we're not the ones.
Who's calling for revolution?
Forsaking citizenship. We're not the ones calling for revolution.
In fact, we're actually advocating against dual citizenship. But who's actually, is Andrew Isker, because he's mentioned Trash World, is Andrew Isker calling for revolution?
No.
Exactly.
Andrew Isker calls the Second Amendment a cope in his book. So he's not calling for revolution at all.
Who's calling for revolution?
He's actually calling for men to have male friendships again. So that's one thing, because he talks about the Second Amendment being a cope. He talks about forming male friendships and having a bond because there's not going to be some sort of revolution because we don't have the capability of it. So you could argue that Andrew Isker is arguing steps before steps before steps before a revolution ever takes place or is fomented, but I think it's just much more basic than that. And he's talking about social ties and rejecting atomization and how that's bad for especially men.
Well, which liberalism created atomization. But
another point that he makes as well. I thought Andrew Isker's Boniface Option was a great book, and I recommend it. I hope my book's as good as that one. It is kind of a cross between his book and maybe someone like Megan Basham's book. That's coming out about shepherds for hire or shepherds for sale. Is that what it's called? Basically, calling out some sellouts in evangelicalism. Maybe it's a cross between the two. I don't know. I don't have the advanced copies of Megan Basham's book like some of these other people do. Maybe we'll get her on over the summer. Her book comes out in July.
The general call of the New Testament is to fight on. It's not to dynamite what exists. By the way, Christians then and now scarcely had and have the political capital necessary to pull this off. And so we've got to just say this honestly. Christian nationalism promises the world. But at least in terms of where things are now, it is vastly over promising and under delivering. Now, people will respond to me and say that's just because we're not all entering into it and we don't all have faith. But here again, the New Testament does not picture the church, normally at least, as this massive global force. There are people from every tribe, tongue, and nation on earth being gathered into the body of Christ, and that is beautiful and wonderful. And there are lots and lots of people out there, thus, who fit that banner. But we are those who don't have a lasting city here. Hebrews 13, 12 to 14. We don't have a permanent home here. We're not told that we should try to establish a permanent home here. We are called by Peter in 1 Peter 2 earlier in that very...
Don't those verses largely have to do with the coming judgment of Jerusalem?
Well, let me just point out that Stephen Wolfe was called a Gnostic for appealing to the Peter verses that he cited in the whole "this world is not our home." So that is very well articulated in Stephen Wolfe's book, and he was called a Gnostic for the whole saying that Adam was heavenly minded.
Yeah, I remember that, and it was James Lindsay leading the charge on that because
And
James
White
Lindsay
too. So
fancies himself an expert on Gnosticism. James White as well. All right, let's just make all the enemies today.
so I mean, yeah.
chapter I
You had anything?
Oh yeah, and the whole Constitution Charter is entirely about overpromising and never delivering. They haven't delivered a single thing except costly court victories.
I cited just a few moments ago, a holy nation. And so that all frames our understanding of our citizenship in this world. We aren't called to launch revolutions, at least in explicit form in the New Testament. We are called to be faithful citizens who live as salt and light here and now. So I would urge you to go back to the Christ-centered realism of the New Testament and be very careful about overly idealistic visions that would tell you and me that we are just minutes away from making this whole thing Christian, when there is no call in the New Testament, in the Great Commission, or anywhere else to make nations Christian, in a formal sense. Instead, what we're supposed to do is make disciples wherever we are, and yes, be a gospel-flavored presence wherever.
Okay, so man, he said something that was an absolute straw man about, oh, we're just minutes away from being a Christian nation. I don't know any Christian nationalist that believes that. If anything, it's more about the long game.
Not even on the dissident right. Yeah. I mean, people in the dissident right are saying, yeah, we're planting trees that will never, be under the shade of. Or, then you have the whole, child rearing, outpopulate the left. And then
these are long game strategies.
Yes. But again, I mean, no one's talking about revolution. No one's talking about overthrowing the government. If anything, they're talking more of a balkanization strategy, which is more of a short-term strategy.
Or alternatively, that the current government is doomed to collapse.
Yes, which, not enough people seem to be talking about. And certainly, Eric Metaxas in Letter to the American Church doesn't talk about. So I got that review coming up just to plug myself.
So I just thought that was a massive straw man. And again, he's focused on the whole fomenting revolution argument. And it's just, again, he doesn't understand what he's grasping or arguing against. And it shows.
Where God has placed us. All this leads to my fourth and final reflection on the call to abandon the Constitution. We need to persevere in hard times today. I've already been at pains to say this. This will be very brief as we wind toward our conclusion. But I think we need to do something a lot harder than launch a revolution. You know what I think we need to do, honestly? We need to endure. We need to bear up under hardship. We need to honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, and honor the emperor. We really do. We need to be good citizens while we're here. We need to, 1 Timothy 2, 1-5, pray for rulers and those in authority over us. It's very frustrating to be under godless leaders. That's not a bad instinct when you feel that. That's a good instinct. But fundamentally, the agency you and I primarily have as believers is not to press a button and make a given country perfect or righteous or Christian. Our agency is primarily concentrated, according to 1 Timothy 2 at least, in prayer. You're supposed to pray for rulers and authorities and local officials. You're supposed to pray that God would work through them and in them such that Christ is known and that you and I can lead a quiet life. That's what Paul says explicitly. The call of 1 Timothy 2, then, is not to a tumultuous campaign of rebellion. The call is the opposite way. It's so that God would work in a fallen world so that his people can lead a quiet life that is well-pleasing to the Lord. All of that should very much inform how we approach the public square today. In everything I'm saying, this is not outmoded material. The New Testament does not fail to instruct us in what to do past a first century context. I'm hearing a version of that argument and have heard it for some time on the Christian nationalist side, that the New Testament is pitched at people who are under the boot of Rome, but we essentially can adopt a different philosophical framework in the public square once there are enough of us that we actually could take over a country. What do we do when we're in the majority or something near the majority of a country? Well, then no longer, the argument basically goes on the CN side, do we have to say, here we have no lasting city? No, we can actually make a lasting city here. That's basically what the CN folks, at least some of them, will claim. But that's not sound. Christians.
So let me touch that this is why he doesn't know what he's grasping with, because I don't think we need to wait to have the majority. I think that's a fool's game, and that's where the Protestant Franco comes in. That's where the Christian Prince comes in to lead and to help usher in a majority.
I mean, can we just talk about how he's trying to delineate the Old Testament from the New Testament, and as if they're completely separated? And again, none of the first century believers believed in a Old Testament and New Testament. They just believed in Scripture. You know, it's all one canon. It's all one continuous story. We insert the pages Old and New Testament into our Bibles. The forefathers did, or the church fathers did not. So if we are in the majority, what laws do you expect would be inflicted? And again, the entire basis of English common law is basically, 10th century theonomy, or like
if you want to call it that.
Yeah, if you want to call it that, it's the general equity of the law of Moses, and as practiced in Britain or England at the time. So that is what you would expect. You would expect things like abortion to be outlawed and criminalized, or homosexuality to not be allowed in a society. That art would reflect the values of the people. So yeah, you would expect these things to exist. And I'm trying to think what else, because again, there's a lot to unpack when he's talking about like needing the majority versus not. And
I mean, he doesn't understand what he's grasping, just again, because that's where the whole Christian Prince Protestant Franco comes in, is because we don't have the majority, and necessarily do we have to wait for that?
Can enter office. Christians can be a majority group in a country, but whatever we do in civic leadership, we never go beyond the New Testament. We don't have a mandate in a negative world to say, well, that worked for them because they were in a very bad place in the first century, and now we're in a new day. And now, even though the New Testament doesn't call for it, we really should bring the Old Covenant law to bear on the public square, and we basically should adopt a kind of new theonomy in our time because, that's what we think would be best. We do not have a call to bring the statutes of Old Testament Israel to bear on the public order today. That is going well beyond what the New Testament teaches. And what the New Testament teaches forms our mission. We don't.
This is the point I forgot. Basically, the Christians that did what he's advocating against actually built something that did last. Like, America was a Christian nation. It lasted 200 years because they actually enforced the laws of the Bible and imposed it. Like the Roman Pantheon, which is like this masterpiece of engineering, was turned into a church. The gladiator game stopped in Rome. So the idea that when Christians take over, they don't impose biblical law is completely asinine.
It's
And Carl,
historically unfounded.
and again, Carl Trueman did the same exact point on his blog of basically starting from a premise of negative or positive world, and basically your entire argument stems from existing off the fruits of the prior generations. When you live in so-called positive world, you don't realize that you're living in positive world, so to speak. Like, he doesn't realize that he's living in the fruits of Christendom, what Christendom built, and saying that we shouldn't impose Christendom on
He's doing the Homer Simpson meme of falling asleep where the Himalayans carry him up the mountain and saying, "Look how far I climbed, and I'm not
Exactly.
even tired." He's doing the meme about what Christendom built, and it had nothing to do with Christians. Look how far we climbed, and we're not tired. Don't ruin it by trying to impose biblical morality on the rest of the population.
But does he not realize that biblical morality was enforced on the population for like 1,000 years, 1,000+ years, depending on which part of Europe you go to?
It's just, it
again,
sense.
Even in America, it was still enforced up in you had, again, sodomy law. Lawrence v. Texas overturned a longstanding Christian law.
Yeah, it's just
why do we have the laws that we have? Where do those laws come from?
And what does Paul say that the purpose of government is? Punish evil, reward good. By what standard do we punish evil, and by what standard do we reward good? The Bible.
He just doesn't understand where law comes from. He thinks law comes out of a vacuum or something.
This guy is he's got all those books around him, but they
obviously aren't reformers. But yeah, and again, when Christians do this, they actually build something that lasts for decades, years, generations. And again, obviously, there's always a problem with passing the torch. But the boomers are basically passing a torch that has no flame on it. So, got to start from somewhere.
So the most prominent books behind him are his own books, War on Men. I believe the one up there is also his own book, but that might be historical theology. Ooh, but I don't think he's read a good historical theology.
Don't go beyond it. We don't re-envision the Great Commission. We go with what the Great Commission is, and we live according to what God has laid out in the New Covenant era as our marching orders. We may see Christians become major political officials in a given country. We may see Christians now and in days to come gain real power, real sway in given countries. If so, praise God, Christians should steward that wisely.
And what does that mean? What then should they do? Please answer that question, Owen.
And seek to pass good laws in those societies.
What are those good laws?
That's a wonderful thing. That's a righteous instinct, but we're not called to theonomize and formalize Christianity in any given nation. I actually think we're called to prioritize the liberty of the individual. That's what Peter talked about. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God.
That's not what Peter
I talk about this in a forthcoming article for the G3 Journal.
That is not what Peter was talking about.
Okay, so does that mean liberty to sin? Does that mean corporations can do whatever they want? Because liberty? No, there has to be a moral standard. Again, this is what Francis Schaeffer talks about with form freedom, the idea that your so-called freedoms are tied to responsibilities. They're tied to duties. That you are a participant in a society. George Costanza, we live in a society. And in order to get those freedoms, you have to adhere to the responsibilities.
Who exactly would agree with him before the year 1800?
Well, no one, because he doesn't realize that America practically was a theonomy in the year 1800.
Yeah, we keep using that word, but I prefer Christian nation. Everywhere Christianity spread to, it was basically formalized to make this place a Christian nation. That basically happened everywhere Christianity went and, took over the government. Was that bad? Was it bad for Tiridates III to make Armenia a Christian nation, or the guy in Georgia who did it next, or uh, Theodosian as the emperor that took it? I'm fumbling on the pronouncing of his name. Was the guy who made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire? Were those wrong? Were those sins? Were those outside the purposes of, government? No, I don't think it was. It was a first table issue, and the government, it's not unjust for the government to enforce the first table of the law, because those are standards of which the Bible says are evil and good. Government's supposed to punish evil. What is more evil than first table violations of the law? The 10 Commandments are in order.
I mean, again, Calvin basically presumes that if you don't enforce the first table, you're not going to enforce the second.
And that's definitely where we're at in today's America. We're not enforcing the second table. Theft, rampant. Homicide, much higher than it used to be growing up. Now, it was like really high back in the day, but we are approaching a modern high. And it's largely because of the woke theology, the wokeness that Owen Strachan supported in the past.
A long, extensive article, but fundamentally, I don't think we seek religious liberty when we're in a difficult situation, and then we retract religious liberty when we're the ones in power. I actually think, though the gospel can go out in any set of circumstances, in any conditions, and disciples can be made in even the toughest of soils, fundamentally, we need to recognize that the gospel, in terms of missionary activity and the formation of churches, exploded in the American context with religious liberty at an all-time high. That greatly matters. That is what so many of us are after, and there are a ton of us who are after.
Again, that's got to be false. When America was founded, and
what is his definition?
What's his basis of America? Christianity exploding in the United States? Is that when we're expanding across the continent? Like, what basis are you saying that?
Well, what's his definition of religious liberty? The ability and right to blaspheme God, to erect satanic statues in a Capitol building.
While America had blasphemy laws. So
I'm just going to point this out, the old super chat. But yeah, I mean, it might have been Mussolini that said it, but it's even the most vilest of dictators did say true things.
Yeah, and liberty is a duty, not a right, is from Mussolini in the super chat from.
I mean, we need
to get
to
the super chat. I didn't quite see it on the live feed, but
yeah,
the funny thing about Mussolini is he was like the most incompetent dictator, one of the more incompetent dictators of the 20th century, and the fact that he understood something so basic is just telling about the leadership state in the United States now.
But yeah, when you treat rights as entitlements, then this is the nation that you end up with.
All right, final stretch.
After this, we sometimes get shouted out online, but many of us recognize that religious liberty is a tremendous blessing, and that there has been this unleashing of the gospel, not under the magisterial countries of the Reformation era and following, for example, but in the last couple centuries, as more and more religious liberty has spread across the world. That is when the gospel has been most unleashed in human history.
Okay, Paul's right there because he's definitely doesn't know what he's talking about here. So, what country spread the gospel the most? The British Empire.
Yeah, Britain and America.
What is the formation of what is the main church in the British Empire? The Anglican Church, which is very much tied to the state. The Anglican Church took, to their credit, they took the gospel everywhere, and we're thankful for that. So his argument sucks because he doesn't understand history. Now let's talk about the magisterial governments in the Reformation. They did not have stability. These happened during a time when the Ottoman Empire was incurring on Europe. Then there's the 30 Years' War of which the first phase of the three phases of that war were largely religious. The latter two phases are largely geopolitical. So there's not a whole lot of stability in Europe in the century after the Reformation. So that would be the explanation. It has less to do with religious liberty and far more to do with stability. In the United States, we had relative stability until the American Civil War. So we had relative stability, which allowed us to spread the gospel manifest destiny style, as well as send missionaries overseas. So, and the gospel is being spread during what period of time in the first century? The Pax Romana, a very stable period of time in Roman history. God knew what he was doing when he, gave Rome a peace so that the gospel would be able to spread more easily during the first century. So I think his anthropology here sucks. In addition to his history sucking this entire time. Final stretch.
Not when there have been territories that are formally Christian, because though there is much good to a lot of people embracing Christianity in a given nation, of course, and laws reflecting that Christian conscience, there's a tension between a formal Christianity and the burning center of the gospel. And the more people in a given context understand themselves as Christian because of where they live, in formal terms that is, the less they tend to convert to Christ. So we want religious liberty, the liberty of the individual, the liberty of the human conscience dialed up. There are going to be weaknesses.
Again, statistically, is there any statistics to back that up?
I mean, he's just basically making Russell Moore's cultural Christianity bad argument.
That is exactly what
he's basically saying, that the existence of hypocrites is worse than the fact that the so-called cultural Christianity mitigates the worst effects of sin on a society.
I mean, what he's saying is much more criticism of Eastern Orthodoxy, in my view. Not a criticism of Protestant Christianity.
This is in that regard. There are going to be unhealthy and even heretical groups that spread in those conditions. That's part of a fallen world, though. You can't stop that. Even if you got a Christian nation, you cannot stop unbelief and falsehood from existing in this world. It is a lie that you can't.
Yeah.
You cannot set up a nation.
Again, how about another history lesson? Between Constantine and some centuries afterwards, there are some pretty good centuries for the Catholic Church where they were actually very effective in stopping and suppressing heretical movements, especially a lot of those early Trinitarian heresies. So, there isn't an Arian denomination of Christianity, right?
No, Jehovah's Witnesses.
Oh, I mean, during that period of time,
Yeah.
You don't see like a schism of the Arian branch. There was a period of time where there was an Arian branch. They got suppressed. You don't see them still exist. They got suppressed. So yeah, there was a time when the Catholic Church, the Papists, were actually pretty effective with the magisterium. Now they had a lot of problems and ultimately succumbed to them, and that's why we had the Protestant Reformation, because the Pope said it was okay to sell indulgences. We got to pay for a massive church here, and therefore it's okay to sell indulgences. That they lost the mandate. They lost the mandate of heaven, in my view, with that. And I think that would be the argument of much of the reformer, like Calvin, right? That would be more his argument. So anyway, they tried, people like Martin Luther and John Huss, they tried to reform the Catholic Church, but they didn't get it. They were basically, ostracized and kicked out for it. So this guy does not understand history, and it shows.
Nation on this earth where basically you can vanquish sin and you can vanquish unbelief and you can vanquish the devil, at least in that territory. You can't do it. What you can do is set up a context, at least work toward it, pray for it, where there is a lot of liberty and people have the freedom of the conscience. And when they have freedom of conscience, at least we've seen this play out in numerous countries across the world, God works and God saves many and the gospel gets unleashed. And so that is what I would point you toward as we conclude this episode. We need to persevere in hard times. We need to not abandon the Constitution. We should not give up on America. In a civic sense, we should keep making the case for liberty in this context. We should keep calling people around us, our neighbor, back to genuinely good principles that were set up in terms of the governance of this nation. I don't think we need to give up on those. We have no call to theonomize this nation, and we should be a people of prayer and a people of real gospel activity wherever God has us. God bless you.
All right, so that is Owen Strachan or Owen Strawman. I don't know. I'll give a last call for questions because we're about to, we've been on an hour and 40. So we'll do last call for questions. Yeah, Owen Strawman, there he is. So any final thoughts on that? I just, to me, I think his church history is bad and his strawmans are, not as bad as his church history. So if he understood history better, maybe he would understand Christian nationalism better and how to articulate an argument against it.
Strawmanning the fact that no one is calling for a revolution. That's I guess strawman number one. That's a presupposition that he brings into the entire conversation. And again, you kind of have to keep whack-a-moling the assertion that the Christian nationalists are calling for a revolution simply because they don't care about the Constitution. No, but which leads to the counterpoint that in order to actually fight the spirit of the age, you have to just be willing to acquire and wield power and do whatever that means. If that means, Bukele level, we're just going to round up the prisoners, the criminals, you got a face tattoo, that means you're going to jail with or without a trial. If that means, deporting, 30 million people that don't belong here with or without trials, that's fine. That's so a lot of the stuff that people are saying that we need to do that we need to do in abandoning said constitution would actually just be more civic matters, not even theonomic matters. Or even how about using the National Guard to shut down Planned Parenthood? That would be,
or deporting illegals.
That's right. Yeah, the 30 million. Or how about using, how do you resolve
doing that, not the federal government?
How do you resolve the national debt through the Congress?
I mean, the fact that we give illegal aliens court dates. No, you don't need a court date. You're not an American citizen. You don't have a right to a trial for entering our country.
And so, I mean, there's a lot of problems that would best be solved.
And it's a stupid test.
Yeah.
Let's see. Formosan Black Bear, would you move to Florida or Texas or even another country? I don't know what country I'd want to live in. Even the thought of moving just to Pennsylvania, just doesn't excite me.
I mean,
so maybe Kentucky, where they're trying to build that Christian community, Ridge Runner, I think is the place that kind of excites me a little bit, but I don't know. That's a tough.
What sucks is a lot of the people that are.
I think Florida's out of it though, because as much as I love alligators, the humidity, I'm not sure I could do. I have a lot of humidity here in Maryland, and as much as I love alligators, that's going to be hard. Texas is very beautiful. Oh, the bigger thing about Florida is probably the real estate concerns, because they're kind of a victim of their own success in some capacity. Texas might be doable, but who knows?
I mean, the problem is a lot of the people that are dismantling our country, they have a country that they can fall back to. We don't really have a country that we can fall back to.
Yeah.
Where are the Irish going to go when Ireland is, replaced? There's nowhere left to go unless, Bukele's opening up his borders.
Uganda forever. But I'm going to learn real quick.
Like a sore thumb,
if I try to Uganda forever, I'm going to learn really quickly that I'm not a Ugandan. I'm going to learn very quickly how white I really am. And I'm never really going to become that culture. It doesn't matter if I'm the guy who wears the Uganda forever jersey. I'm never really going to be Ugandan, no matter how hard I try. Like even Vodi Bakum said, he's like, yeah, I mean, he's black, right? But he's in Zambia and he's like, I ain't African. And he's pretty blunt about that. So I think that's kind of like a huge barrier to moving to another country. To another state, it's a little easier, but there are some states, like I hear Kansas is the type of state where if you're not from Kansas, the people let you know. So who knows? Innovation HQ, why don't you get a theonomist to discuss if Christian nationalism or theonomy is better? Man, I feel like Sam Jones was a theonomist, so
The problem is
maybe we've discussed that.
A lot of those people might be the same people.
There are white people in Uganda. Uganda forever. So no one in Florida
Bruce loves Uganda, though.
Yeah, I know Florida's not one of those states because no one lived in Florida 120 years ago. You know, it was a backwater state for the first 100 years of its existence. And then it became the third most populated state in the union because of air conditioning. So there's a reason for these things. So thanks for the questions. It's 145 minutes in. So I think it's time to hop off and have a good night. Stay based. Christ is king, and we will catch